Welcome back to Launchpad. We are live here in Las Vegas at reInvent 2019. I'm Robert with AWS, and joining with me here today is Nate, Akshay, and Matt. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Nate Tabor, and I'm a product manager on the Amazon EKS team.
Hey, I'm Akshay Ram. I'm a product manager with AWS Fargate.
And I'm Matt Fitzgerald, a somewhat familiar face on this stage. I'm the head of developer relations for Asia Pacific, China, and Japan.
Excellent. So I understand we have some exciting announcements here that you're going to go over for us across EKS and Fargate. Nate, take it away.
So we're super excited about this. Yesterday we announced the availability of Amazon EKS with AWS Fargate. So this is a new integration. We've had Fargate out for a little while now. We've had Amazon EKS as a production Kubernetes service on AWS for the last few years here. And now what we're doing is we're bringing the ability for you to launch Amazon EKS Kubernetes pods onto the serverless AWS Fargate compute resources, right? So what this really allows you to do is to get the serverless benefits of Fargate, the best practices of running Kubernetes with Amazon EKS, and the extensibility of the Kubernetes API all in a single place.
So let's have a look at it from the customer perspective for a second. So is this, obviously this is going to be good for existing Kubernetes customers.
Absolutely.
And good for existing EKS customers.
Absolutely.
Are we still saying this is a good platform for new customers who haven't even ventured into the container?
Yeah, absolutely. So normally when you run a Kubernetes cluster, there's a lot of things that you have to think about, right? You have to start up the cluster control plane, and that's something that we really manage for you, and we have a team that's dedicated to doing that at scale for customers with Amazon EKS. And then there's the second part, right? Before you even get to running your applications, you have to worry about all the places where those pods are going to run, where those apps are actually running. You have to worry about EC2 instances, how do you scale those instances, how do you provision, update the lifecycle. There's a whole bunch of operations that our customers were telling us, this is a lot of work, can you help us make this even easier? And so what Fargate does is it gives you a per pod compute environment, and it gives you resources that are dedicated per Kubernetes pod that you run, and those resources scale and are allocated on demand. So with Fargate, you don't actually have to worry about provisioning nodes, updating nodes. You just go to Kubernetes, you run your pods, and they run on Fargate, and you get things like pod level metrics, pod level billing visibility, and all the same features that you would expect from Kubernetes, things like exec and logs. You can use all the standard Kubernetes templates and deployments that you're used to. If you're running applications on Kubernetes, it's really easy to actually just use EKS, and you can start running those on Fargate without changing anything in terms of how your applications are deployed or specified in the Kubernetes API.
Wait a minute, are you telling me that running Minikube on my Raspberry Pi is not production ready?
Well, how many Raspberry Pis do you have in your bedroom?
I mean, one.
Oh, that might not be it. That's actually a really good point. The way that we built Amazon EKS was to be a production-ready, highly available Kubernetes service, right? So when we run an Amazon EKS cluster for you, what you're actually getting is a highly available Kubernetes control plane that's spread across 3 different AWS availability zones in a region. So an AWS availability zone, right, is a separated data center on a separate power supply, separate floodplain. We have really highly available infrastructure we're building on top of here, and we're running the etcd persistence layer and the API servers across 3 AZs, and we're running those on dedicated EC2 hosts, right? So we have this highly available configuration, and that lets us actually give a 99.9% SLA for every Kubernetes cluster that we run. And so nothing actually changes in terms of EKS or the cluster or the control plane that you're running, and you can continue to actually run EC2 virtual machines for your pods as well alongside Fargate. You just get the choice. Do I want to run on highly available, highly reliable EC2 VMs, or do I want to run on highly scalable, highly available, right-size optimized Fargate serverless compute?
Yeah, so we got a question in Twitch chat from Failbur, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Is the idea serverless Kubernetes? Because what you're describing sounds like more of like a managed environment, but how should we think about this?
Yeah, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think when we spoke to customers, there were 3 segments. One was customers who said, self-manage my instances for me. That's why we launched managed node groups.
Yeah.
There was a segment who want to manage VMs themselves. They want to bin pack, and they want those benefits of bin packing, and they can drive a lot of efficiency, and they're savants at that. And then there was a large segment which essentially said, I don't want to see an EC2 instance in my account. It should be completely managed. I just want to run my pods and enable application first thinking. I just want to use, I like the Kubernetes API, and I want to run on Fargate. That's it. And then you manage the instances. I don't see the instances. I don't need to patch the instances. I don't need to run taints and tolerations to figure out what, if two pods are co-located on the same host, because on Fargate they're completely, each pod is isolated with the VM boundary, and you get clean cost allocation. So if you're an application owner, you say, okay, I'm running these pods, and you can use the service construct of an orchestrator, and then you can see a bill, and then you say, okay, this is my application, and I paid this much to run this application. So it enables that simplification, but there are use cases for each. And I think there was another question which says, can you mix Fargate and self-managed node groups? Do you want to answer that, Nate?
Yeah, you absolutely can. I mean, what you can do is you can define your application on Kubernetes, and then inside of Amazon EKS, you can decide which pods you actually want to run on Fargate and which pods you want to run on your EC2 instances. So depending on the requirements of your workload and how much work you want to do to scale that, you can actually make that choice in EKS, and you get all of that managed by AWS. So the difference is that with Fargate, you don't have to worry about things like scaling nodes or which AMI you're using or updating them. You just run your pods. And with Amazon EKS managed node groups, you can actually use the EKS API to provision those EC2 instances in your account, and it behaves just the way that EC2 behaves on your cluster today. I actually have a little demo of Fargate. Do you want to check it out?
Absolutely.
All right, let's check it out.
Which chat, you ready for demos?
Let's take a demo. Okay, cool. So here I am in my cluster, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to do a really quick thing, and I'm going to do a get pods, and I have nothing in my namespace here, so this is empty namespace. But let's go ahead and take a look at all the pods that I have running on this cluster. So if I look at all my pods, I'll see I have 2 core DNS pods running. And this is pretty cool. Core DNS is a really common component of a Kubernetes cluster. It provides the domain name service discovery for pods that are running within the cluster, so different services can find each other easily, right? So this is running in my kube system namespace. And let's actually take a look here at what nodes I have running. Now, I want to preface this is a Fargate-only cluster. There's no EC2 instances running on this cluster at all. And when I do a kubectl get nodes, I'm going to see that I actually have 2 nodes that show up. So each of these nodes represents the system resources, the Kubernetes resources that are provisioned to run Fargate on my cluster. So to run these pods, we have to run things like kubelet, kubeproxy, all those kind of standard Kubernetes components. Remember, we're not changing Kubernetes here. We're just giving you the ability to run on serverless compute. So let's actually clear this out, and let me show you something in the console. So this is how we actually do this in the EC2 console, or in the AWS console, right? So I come into my cluster. I have a great cluster name here, Ferocious Sheepdog. And I go down and I see two panes here. I have my EKS managed node groups where I can provision EC2 instances directly onto my cluster. And then I have this thing called Fargate profile. So what a Fargate profile does is it gives context to the pods that you're running. So when you run that pod on AWS, you need a few things. You need permissions. What permissions does the pod have to go and do things on your behalf on AWS and in other systems? Mainly things like pulling container images down. And then you also need context. So you need things like subnets. Where do I actually want this pod to run? So you'll see that I have that context for the pods that I'm giving it. I have a list of subnets where I want to run my Fargate pods. And then I also have an execution role, and that's giving the kubelet on the pods permissions to go and do things like download a container image that I want to run. And then at the same time, I have these things called selectors, and these are living under the Fargate profile. These basically say what namespaces, when I launch a pod in that namespace in Kubernetes, where do I want that pod to land? If I put the namespace here, and I can optionally put some labels to target pods specifically, then when I launch that pod on Kubernetes, it's actually going to go ahead and run on Fargate instead of on EC2. So let's go in here and let's actually launch a pod. I have a few demo apps here. I'm going to just launch this really quick replica set and a service. So I'm going to launch these things. So I'm launching some quick pods here with some YAML files, and let's go ahead and look at this. So if I do a get pods, I see that I have my pod here, and that pod is pending. This pod is going to take about 25 seconds to start up, and then it's going to be running on Fargate.
So there's another question that's come up just while you're doing that. They're saying, when and why would I not use this all the time?
That's a great question. We've really built this with the idea that you can run it in production on EKS. So there are a few limitations to Fargate, and these are mainly Fargate limitations. So the biggest limitations that Fargate has today is that things that weren't supported on Fargate, things like daemon sets, for example. If you're using daemon sets on Kubernetes, we're provisioning a unique compute environment for every pod that you run, and so something like a daemon set just doesn't make sense, because we would just have a lot of pods and they wouldn't be able to talk to each other. Because every single pod that you run is in an isolated compute environment. We're having customers and partners, they're actually running daemon sets as sidecars. And when you run things as a sidecar, so which meaning that any agents for monitoring or logging are packaged alongside of your application containers, that works really, really well on Fargate.
Having said that, we're also working with partners to slim down daemon sets and make them really light. We're working with the FluentBit community to make logging really light and so that it runs as a slim daemon set. And I think another thing, Nate, is also if you use GPUs is not supported on Fargate. If you need any specialized instance, you'd probably want to use an EC2 instance instead of Fargate. So those are like use cases you'd probably use EC2 over Fargate.
I see.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to show is you can take a look here. My pod at the top actually started running. Maybe it's a little hard to see, so I'll zoom in here. So I have this pod, and that pod is running now. And if I look at my nodes, I'll see that Fargate actually provisioned a new compute resource to run that pod. I didn't have to run any EC2. I didn't have to do any cluster auto-scaling. I started that pod, and I got it. And if I can actually do really cool things, like I can actually exec into these pods. So I can exec straight into this pod. Oh, that's going to fail. It's going to fail because I'm doing it incorrectly.
Oh.
All right.
Oh,
so we're going to clear that out. That's a demo error. We'll call it good. But I think we got the picture of how the pods work and how you can just pretty much come to Kubernetes.
Yeah, I think the point was
and you can run things immediately.
Yeah, it's the familiarity you get with your API.
Yeah,
it continues with Fargate, so there's no context switch.
So I'll ask the question that I always ask when I see a service that can do a lot of orchestration for me. How badly can I mess this up? So can I go into EC2 and then can I go into the VPC? Can I cut off connection between the different subnets and then just make this whole thing completely broken? And then how quickly can I repair that?
That's a good question because it's something that happens to people, right? I mean, if you go in and you start deleting VPCs, you start deleting subnets, even on EC2, that's going to fail. That's going to cause issues, right? So it's the same kind of thing. We're using the VPCs and we're using the subnets and the networking that you define to launch these pods. But there's actually a lot less that you can mess up here, right? So all the compute infrastructure is run by AWS. It's sitting behind our firewall, and we're running it for you. So it's really hard to misconfigure this. You just launch your pods, and you don't need to worry about how you've configured that instance. You don't need to worry about, did you choose the right instance type? Did you launch that instance in the right availability zone? Does it have the right permissions? All that's handled by AWS.
Mm-hmm. So would you recommend creating your subnets in advance and using existing VPCs?
Yes.
And doing all that, so by hand, and then pointing the service to that or letting that happen automatically?
So actually, we have a really cool tool that we've worked with our partner Weaveworks to build called EKS Cuddle. So EKS Cuddle is a command line for EKS clusters, and it actually supports Fargate profiles today. So you can do a command, EKS Cuddle create a cluster, and you can do -- Fargate, and we'll actually create a cluster for you. We'll create a cluster for you that's a Fargate-only cluster, and that has Fargate profiles pre-configured on it. And EKS Cuddle will actually handle all that for you. It'll handle setting up the VPCs, setting up the subnets, setting up the roles, all the best practices that you need to have an EKS cluster that's production ready in a matter of minutes.
So you mentioned this is good for production workloads. What's the story around observability and monitoring side of things? Is this tightly integrated into CloudWatch and CloudWatch logs?
Yeah, so we'll be coming out with support for CloudWatch metrics and CloudWatch logs on EKS Fargate really soon. There's been a lot of work that's been done on the rest of Fargate as well over the last few months.
Yeah, we're thinking about so we launched this feature called FireLens on ECS Fargate, which we plan to bring on EKS Fargate as well, and essentially simplifies logging from whichever destination you want to. It can go anywhere. Today, you'd probably have to use a sidecar and do it using a sidecar. You'd have to set up your logging today.
Yep.
But going forward, we're going to simplify it a lot more.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. The other thing that we've had a question, it's scrolled off the screen, but it's a question I had as well. Tell us a story around the pricing. What's the pricing model for this?
Yeah, so one of the things that was really important for us is that Fargate is a serverless compute layer for containers running on AWS, right? So we see Fargate as working equivalently underneath ECS or underneath EKS. So the biggest difference when you're using Fargate is the orchestrator, and it's the APIs. If you're using ECS and you really like the ECS APIs, those are something that you have tooling built around, then Fargate works really great with ECS. And our mission here and our vision here is that if you're using Kubernetes and you're using Kubernetes APIs and you have tooling and you're comfortable with those APIs, then you can use Fargate as well. And because of that, the pricing is the same. So Fargate is Fargate, and you pay per vCPU and per gigabyte of memory per hour for every pod that you run, and it's the same pricing whether you're using ECS or EKS.
Yeah, so another question we have here from Twitch chat from David R7777. What's the, I think he means main benefit of Kubernetes running over a service on Fargate with ECS? And you alluded to what happens when you have daemon services and how, so that's one distinction. Are there others that you want to call out?
I think the other distinction is the same restrictions that we have with Fargate today, right? So with Fargate, we manage the host. We're actually managing the underlying compute infrastructure for you. And so things like privileged containers aren't going to work on Fargate. Things that need access to the host, but we actually see that as a security benefit. Privileged containers can be very tricky in certain environments. You really want to know the code that you're running there. And so that's just something that's fully managed by AWS. And we think that that's the right model for customers. And most of our customers that we talk to, something like privileged containers, things like daemon sets. Daemon sets aren't quite legacy. Privileged containers can be a lot of times for legacy workloads. There's a lot of ways to implement these architectures and these applications without using those things. And we really encourage customers to adopt those models, and they work really well on Fargate.
Mm-hmm. And then another question down here by Wayne Folks. Is there an AWS logs driver like in ECS? And I think we answered this earlier for EKS, right? And the answer here should be yes, I assume?
No, right now you have to use the sidecars. The way it works on ECS Fargate is you just select AWS logs and the plumbing happens.
Yeah.
Right now you have to go through a few additional steps.
Got it.
That's the part where we said going forward we'll make it much easier such that you don't have to sidecar anything, it just works.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
And I do want to point out, there's a lot of great things about Fargate. There's stuff like this logging driver that we're still working on that's coming out. We actually, our team maintains a public roadmap on GitHub. I'd really encourage people to check this out. If you go to GitHub and you search for AWS Containers Roadmap, we have a public roadmap of all the stuff that we're working on for ECS, Fargate, EKS, all the AWS container services. We put all the things that we're working on that we're coming out with on GitHub. We track them as issues, and we really encourage people that are watching, if you're using these services, if you think there's something that you need or that you'd like to see us do better, file an issue on there, have a conversation with us. This is a place where we're engaging every day with our customers, and it's where we're going to be tracking progress towards things like integrated logging and more capabilities, more features over time with both EKS and with Fargate.
All right, it looks like we are nearing the end of our time. Is there a URL that customers can visit to learn more about the announcements that we made at reInvent here?
Yeah, I think we have a general containers page, aws.amazon.com/containers. You can also check out the AWS News blog or the AWS Containers blog. We'll be posting all week there. And of course, our containers roadmap has all the latest announcements and all of the things that we've been shipping for the services in general, including and not including reInvent.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you for your time, and we will be back soon. Stay tuned, Twitch.